Thank you and good morning. Thanks everybody for taking some time this morning to be part of this conversation. We think it's a very important conversation, and we're excited about lifting up this work and lifting up the work of our partners. I first do want to just recognize and thank a few folks in the room, and this is for me and for those of us at NCBA CLUSA. It's really gratifying to have kind of this mix of folks in the room. It really kind of exemplifies what NCBA CLUSA is all about, which is bringing forth the cooperative principles, empowering people across the world and domestically here in the United States. So definitely want to thank the folks from USAID that are here and USDA. Thanks for being here. We actually have we have an NCBA CLUSA board member right up here on the dais. So Hans Dyer here, he helps lead the association and provide strategic vision and direction for the association. So thank you, Hans. Of course, the partners that we do work with, many of you are in the room here on the stage too, IFC and McCormick. Thank you for your long-term partnership, both. The broader co-op community. There's a number of folks from the domestic co-op community I've got to say hello to this morning, including at least one, if not more, co-op development organizations here domestically to be part of the conversation and to help learn. So thank you all for being here. Just a moment on NCBA CLUSA. I suspect most people in the room have a sense or maybe know well who we are. We've been in the United States for 103 years. We're the apex, the umbrella association for cooperatives here in the United States. And nearly 65 years ago, this group of leaders from cooperatives here in the United States determined to use some of their goodwill, some of their resources to help others across the world use the cooperative principles, the cooperative values to empower people in their economy through their businesses. First in India, but then fast forward to today, we've been in over 80 countries. Today we're in 21 countries and about 30 different programs, partnering certainly with USAID and USDA, but also with folks like McCormick's and others who who provide the resources for us to do the work, and it's great work. As NCBA CLUSA turned to our second 100 years a few years ago, the board and the staff kind of took a deep dive and thought about what is it that we can do to make sure that we help cooperatives, we help people build a better world. And we determined that we really focused again on how we as an association, we as in our development work, how we can help create economic opportunity for people. And we came upon a framework around an inclusive economy. And we thought what we needed to do was make sure that people understood how co-ops can help people build a more inclusive economy, an economy that's participatory, more equitable, where there's growth for everybody, where the economy is stable and it is sustainable. And the work and the conversation around developing sustainable supply chains to cooperatives, I think, is a great example of how cooperatives can really help build that more inclusive economy. So thank you again for being here. I want to get to the conversation and learn. And I want to introduce your moderator today and one of the great team members we have at NCBA CLUSA. Rebecca Savoy has more than 20 years of international development experience, primarily in Africa. You have the bio here, and I recommend that you read it. I will just mention and highlight that very recently Rebecca earned her PhD and in rural sociology and community, what is it? I just read it a little bit ago.
Agriculture, economics.
In agriculture, yeah. And so we're excited to have Rebecca help lead the conversation today and bring her, I can tell you, her passion, not only her expertise, but her passion for this work to the stage. So Rebecca, please.
Thanks, Doug. I think that comes, yeah, thank you. Thanks so much, Doug. It's always great to hear how you present our organization at this as we enter into our next 100 years of work, which is wonderful as well. We're starting out this morning with a little, well, first of all, thanks everyone for coming. This room is full of, as Doug mentioned, a very diverse group of people. And maybe I'll just kind of run through the process here. So we are launching our cooperative development project, and we'll just, that's kind of how we're going to start. You see that on your agenda. And then the panelists will each introduce themselves. And then because the room has so many different kinds of people, we're going to quickly go into a discussion. And so as you hear their introductions, we have some questions. We'll get the dialogue started, but we want you to feel very, very welcome. This room is very conducive to an engaged and active participation. So that's kind of the process for our morning. Does that sound good to everyone? Thumbs up, excellent. And please make sure that you have coffee and all those things that are in the back still. So here's my clicker, okay. So our cooperative development project, Emily Varga, could you raise your hand here? There's Emily. Emily works for USAID, and she is in charge of what is arguably one of the most unique kinds of procurement models that I've seen, at least at USAID. Emily is in charge of the cooperative development project. It's kind of a unique funding piece. It's an earmarked piece of congressional earmarked fund, $60 million over 5 years. It's in the E3 Bureau, which is based here in Washington, and so that's economic growth, education, and the environment. And Emily does the work of, she's got a lot of energy, and she has, in order to make this cooperative development project inside of this bureau in Washington come alive, we that are cooperators know how cool this is. There's 12 of us currently that are implementing this project. The only way that we can get funds from this pot of money is if you're a cooperative development organization, so that's kind of interesting as well. And Emily has done just a remarkable job at kind of promoting how the cooperative business model can be solutions within a lot of development contexts. And so we've enjoyed and are supportive of her going across different bureaus and kind of describing to people, because the cooperative business model means different things to different people, right? So that's one of the challenges that we have. When you say the word co-op, some people have one idea of what it is and other people may have a different thing. And so then how can you develop a program that has cooperative development if you're not quite sure how that can provide a solution to the market failure economic development issue that you're trying to address? And so for us, we're thrilled. NCBA CLUSA has been a longtime recipient of this cooperative development project funding. Yeah, and so that's what we're kicking off here today. Okay, so a quick note on our structure here at NCBA CLUSA. And so about a year and a half ago, maybe 2 years ago, the organization really restructured into 3 technical buckets. The leadership at the time said, geez, what do we do well? And where do we want to focus our energies? And it's in these 3 areas. You can also see on the banners here. So we have building resilient communities, and Doug Steinberg, my colleague, runs that practice area. He's in Niger at the moment. We have creating economic opportunities, and my colleague Will Bullock, who's on the panel here, is the lead of that practice area. And then I lead the strengthening producer cooperatives and producer organization. So that's kind of how we're structured. And then, yeah, those are the technical buckets that we work in. And in some ways, of course, in our business, these things connect. I often describe our practice area as a subset. If Will's looking at all kinds of business models, a cooperative business model perhaps is one option of many within that. So our CDP project, we call it Creating an Environment for Cooperative Expansion. We call it the CC project, acronyms. And so what is so unique, in my opinion, about this cooperative development program is we have a lot of ability within the way that the procurement is structured to learn and to test and to develop some new models and to do research and to identify how do development programs really result in long-lasting, sustainable, business-oriented cooperatives that 20 years later, we can see the evidence of how that business is still functioning. Maybe it's evolved 10 times, but it's still solving those economic issues for those communities. It's pretty unique in the way that we do that, and we also do that in a collaborative way. The Overseas Council for Cooperative Development, OCDC, is an entity that all of the CDO members, the cooperative development organizations, participate in. So we have this requirement for collaboration, which is not always obvious, which is not always required in a lot of different types of procurements. Our CC project is in 5 countries. We're in Guatemala, Peru, Tanzania, Kenya, and Madagascar. And in each country, we've selected each country with intention, and we work in 3 general lines of work that align with the procurement that Emily had put out last year. And so first we said, you know, okay, how can we at NCBA CLUSA really move the needle in, we say, clearing the lane and creating a pathway for cooperative development? How do we unlock some of those hurdles so others might invest in it, so private sector partners might be a little bit more interested in figuring out how to have that relationship with smallholders? We, in that public space, in that public sector space, how can we do some of the work to create that kind of commercial environment for participation by the private sector and co-ops? So we thought about, you know, looking at the way that NCBA CLUSA has tackled this work for a long time. We came up with these ideas. So first, at the macro level, this project really looks at the enabling environment. Our hypothesis here is, if the national law indicates that assets of a cooperative can be seized without notification, it might be a little bit uncomfortable for an organization like McCormick's to do business with those co-ops. And so we have a tool that was developed by this OCDC group called the Clarity Analysis. And so we're looking at what are the enabling and disabling features of the cooperative law in each of these 5 countries. And then in each country, we're operationalizing that a little bit differently, but that information will help to unlock some of those potential hurdles for the cooperative in that enabling environment space. Sometimes in some places, like in Madagascar, we've been asked to create a national cooperative development strategy that's being presented to the ministry. In some places, we're informing some laws or policy pieces that will then go in front of the parliament. And so different things in different places, but all with this sort of analytical analysis on what can be done from this enabling environment space to clear that pathway for cooperative development. Secondly, we were thinking, you know, if you look in the US here, cooperatives, there's some phenomenal cooperatives, long, you know, kind of long enduring, resilient businesses. Land O'Lakes is here today, and that's an example of one of them, right? They've been around for a long time, their businesses evolved, they're commercially viable. So how did that happen? Well, you know, here in the US, there's a lot of institutions and organizations that support cooperative development. We have our cooperative development centers all over the US. We have training organizations. We have accountants that understand cooperative finance. We have tax attorneys that understand cooperative law. So in the environments where we work, what about looking at the institutions and organizations that support cooperative development? And so our business model for this project is to say the lion's share of the work will be done through partner institutions and organizations. So we're kind of whispering in the ear. In Kenya, it's the Cooperative Alliance of Kenya. It's an organization that needs a lot of support to build up, but we want to be in the background and help them to start to shine and really be, geez, when you're in Kenya, if you're in a co-op and you have a question, who do you call? Well, maybe you should call the Cooperative Alliance of Kenya. And we're trying to build their capacity up to do that, looking at institutions and organizations. These are public and private. We try to find university partners in all the countries where we work, and so there's a lot of partnership. This is a partnership project for sure. And then the third piece is really looking specifically at co-ops themselves. And our thinking here is, if a cooperative is allocating member equity, things must be working pretty well. If we're in a co-op here, if we're vanilla farmers in Madagascar, and we trust our business enough that we're selling through our co-op, we understand that some of our earnings are being retained my money is being retained by this cooperative, and some of it's being allocated in accounts, and I trust the accounting to do that. Our hypothesis is that if a co-op is booking member equity and they have a capitalization plan that's functioning, wow, things must be working pretty well. We don't see many examples of this in certain parts of the world. In fact, we are hard to find any examples of co-ops in some of the environments where we work that have any allocated member equity on their books. Sometimes it's because the legal environment isn't very clear on how that's done. Sometimes it's just not a practice that's ever been done. And so the third work stream is, okay, we're using some of the fantastic tools that IFC has produced that Dieter will perhaps mention in a moment, some of the Ag Leadership Program training materials, this Foundations of Cooperatives, and we're just saying, okay, what does it take for these co-ops, we're not really looking at production, we're not looking at a lot of different features of what development programs sometimes look at. We're working in partnership with others that do that. For example, in Peru, Equal Exchange and CRI, now known as Genex, the genetic animal genetics company out of Shawnee, Wisconsin. So they're all in Peru, and they have commercial businesses there in coffee and cocoa and livestock. And our work is really just looking at that organizational structure. We're really laser focused in on the cooperative business. What does it take to understand that cooperative business? So we do it from the enabling environment, we do it looking at institutions and organizations, and then at this co-op specific work. And so this project is, it's exciting. And we're working on a lot of, we're doing a lot of interesting monitoring, or a lot of sort of evaluation, I guess, or research, maybe it's simply call that. We've built in some longitudinal studies that we'll be doing, so we'll be able to have different points of measure at each of these levels, so we can really attribute, we were saying, like, how can we attribute our efforts within this project to understand, did our project design really move the needle like we had expected it might? And so we're trying to make sure we're working closely with Emily's M&E team and our in-house M&E team to make sure that we're designing some sort of research models that then in the next, when anyone else is interested in cooperative development, that we can say, look, we tried this and this was the outcome here in this country, this is what we did here, and these are the things that were really successful, these are the things that didn't work so well. And we'd like to get that out, because one of the problems with development is we've done a lot of the same things over and over again, and the learning piece is difficult to operationalize within the work that we do. And so maybe I'll just take a moment and see if there's any, maybe maybe if there's a clarifying question about what I've just presented before we move on to the transition into what the panel will discuss. So in that, I know these guys are much more interesting, really, once we get into the meat here. And so in that, all of this work that we're doing is really to create cooperatives, right, that are professional, we use the word, that are operating in a way, they're commercially viable private sector businesses, co-ops, that are then attractive for partnership with buyers. A lot of the cooperatives that we work with, they're producing commodities, they're commodity buyers, more and more buyers. In the years that I've been in Africa, more and more commodity buyers are looking for that solution. And because of the dynamics, Dieter will talk a little bit about this, the smallholder farmer is really an important part of that solution, about that supply chain solution in a lot of different commodities. And so how can we as development practitioners that work in that public space offer something to create a space where that relationship is successful over time? And so this is why we chose this theme for our panel today, is we thought, gosh, let's really get into the weeds a little bit and understand from both the smallholder producer side, from the development organization, from organizations in like the IFC that their clients are the commercial businesses, from commercial partners like McCormick's, and understand a little bit about what that kind of relationship looks like. So with that, I welcome you all to this robust discussion that we are about to embark on. And I think I would like to Each of the panelists will come up and introduce themselves, and I would like to first introduce to the stage Dieter Fischer with the IFC. Welcome, Dieter. Thanks, everyone.
Good morning. So I'm Dieter Fischer. I'm with the International Finance Corporation. We are part of the World Bank Group. There we are. So I have actually two roles at IFC. My day job is I'm the lead for our agribusiness advisory programs in Latin America. And then my hobby job, let's say, is working on tools for smallholder supply chains. And my colleague, Alan Johnson, sitting in the back there, hi, Alan, there you go, is my co-conspirator in this space. So we're very pleased. A number of organizations that we work with quite closely are in the room, and it's great to see everybody. So I'm going to give a very brief overview of starting with the World Bank Group and then zooming in on some of the work that we're doing with smallholder supply chains, and then I think we'll get into more depth during the discussion. So our mantra is creating markets. We work in the emerging markets, both lower income, middle income, and fragile conflict-affected states. We are part of a larger organization, the World Bank Group, and the World Bank side of it has two parts, IDRB and the IDA. So the IDA is probably the most relevant for this audience. That's the group that works in the lower income countries. And I'm sure you're familiar with the World Bank's work, but it's really quite extensive, and quite huge volumes of funding are going into agribusiness and other space in developing countries through the IDA program. And more we're trying to cooperate with them so that we have this approach called maximizing finance for development. So the idea is that the combination of public sector and private sector can create synergies, which can create an enabling environment for private sector to enter into emerging markets. The fourth piece on the right side is MIGA, which is a sovereign risk guarantee institution. And then we are the IFC in the middle. We have, our primary business is financing emerging market companies, and we have advisory services that accompany those investments. So these are the range of financial products that the IFC offers. I think the ones most relevant for us would be loans, equity, trade finance, and then risk-sharing facilities. And maybe the most interesting for supply chain finance are these risk-sharing facilities where we work in collaboration with financial institutions, off-takers, to create a facility that can fund farmers. And we've done a number of these programs in various markets and various commodities. Here we go. The IFC has quite an extensive global footprint. These are our country-level offices. And so in most countries where we all work, there's an IFC office. And if people would like to be introduced to the right colleagues on the investment or the advisory side in a particular market, please let me know, or Alan, and we can put you in touch with the folks that would either work with companies on the investment side or design projects on the advisory side. In FY18, we did $23 billion of financing. About 4.7, I believe, was in agribusiness. So the agribusiness portfolio is quite significant and ranges across all of these countries. So now I'm going to come down to the advisory services where Alan and myself work. We are linked to the Manufacturing, Agribusiness, and Services Group. And we primarily work in agribusiness, although we're also developing products in the manufacturing and the services space. So I'll talk today about the work that we're doing in the agribusiness space with advisory services. And all of these activities are linked to our investments. So we have a sort of a matrix of regional focus and then sectoral. And so the four sectors which have been selected because they match the areas that our clients are working in: animal protein, food safety, smallholder supply chains, and water, irrigation, and soil. Animal protein space, most of our clients are either dairy, poultry, or beef companies. In food safety, we work with a wide range of companies up and down the supply chain, so everything from aflatoxin work with smallholder farmers, up to quality control in supermarkets, processing, food processing companies, certifications like HACCP. Water efficiency, we're working with irrigation companies like Netafim, Jane Irrigation, but also with users of irrigation services. So for example, cotton companies in West Africa developing simple technologies for water storage so that cotton farmers can do supplemental irrigation. So the area that Alan and myself work on is the smallholder supply chains. And so this looks at all aspects of smallholder supply chains from production through marketing. In this space, our clients, the majority of them would be off-takers. So these would be global brands or moving one step further upstream to national companies which are aggregating product for brands in sectors like cocoa, coffee, palm oil, basically sugar, any sector where it's a cash crop, we're probably involved somewhere. And we'll talk a little bit more about what we're doing, but we're developing a set of tools for professionalism, to increase the professionalism of smallholder farmers at various levels in the supply chain. And Alan is based in Addis, and I'm based here in DC. So this is our theory of change in the smallholder space. If you look at the axis on the left, that's the level of professionalism of either an individual farmer or an aggregation of farmers, which could be a producer organization, could be an agro retailer, could be an SME collector. And we believe that over time, as professionalism increases, there are increased opportunities for these smallholders suppliers. And so opportunities to increase productivity through training, and then opportunities eventually to access finance and to link with global value chains. We also believe that on the x-axis, that we should be rigorous and quantitative in how we look at professionalism. So we've developed a system, along with other folks that are in this room, under a practice group which is called the Agribusiness Market Ecosystem Alliance. It's known as AMEA. It's about 23 organizations and companies at this point. And all of the members of AMEA subscribe to the belief that we should be rigorous about assessing professionalism of co-ops and other aggregation points, and that we should be a rigorous methodology for providing training and coaching. And in our world, we call this the Agribusiness Leadership Program. So that's a set of assessment tools and capacity building curriculum that we use in our smallholder supply chains. And I'd like to also mention another initiative that the AMEA members have launched. It's to define professionalism for producer organizations. So we've been working together to develop an ISO standard for professionalism of smallholder producer organizations. And we're very happy to announce that this IW, it's called an International Workshop Agreement. It's an interim step towards an ISO standard. The IWA was published yesterday, actually. So if you Google IWA 29, you will find this standard, which was the result of a global sort of consultation, and then a meeting late last year where we came to a consensus around what this definition, these guidelines would include. So I think that's a very interesting initiative, and I think you'll be hearing a lot more about it as the publicity starts rolling out about this. And we're kind of on a track of 2 to 3 years to move towards the full standard. So we would invite everybody in this room to be part of that process, both using the guidelines as they stand now and providing suggestions as to how these guidelines can be finalized into an ISO standard. So the Agribusiness Leadership Program, it's primarily focused in Africa at this point. These are the countries where we're working. We've been doing it for about 3 years now, so there's a pretty good track record now with the number of producer organizations that have participated and the farmers. We have 17 different training modules. These training modules are licensed by IFC to AMEA, so all AMEA members can access these modules and use them in their own programs. And we're working with a number of folks in this room in that way. So in each of these cases, which are shown here, there's an off-taker, maybe too small to see, but Olam is there, Telcar, which is a Cargill joint venture, Heineken. We also work with Ecom. So all the sort of large aggregators of cash crops are quite interested in this approach because it gives them a way to segment their supply chains and to understand, who the stronger producer organizations are, and then it's also a capacity building, a way to track the capacity building that they're doing. And so last, I'll give you a shameless plug for a publication that's also just been released. It's a manual for practitioners who are working with smallholders in supply chains. And I think we feel it's innovative because it looks at smallholder supply chains from the firm perspective. So we're looking at it from the perspective of our clients who are trying to procure products from smallholder supply chains. And our clients are interested in how can they organize supply chains efficiently, how can they provide training at lower cost, how can financing be provided. So that's some of the material that's covered in this handbook. And you could buy it on Amazon, or you could download it for free. And if you actually Google OKR, which is the Open Knowledge Repository of the World Bank, and working with smallholders, it'll come up. And you can have the hard copy or the free digital copy. So, great, thanks very much.
Thanks, Dieter. Thanks, that was great. That was perfect, thanks. So, wow, that was a lot of excellent information. You have a question? Can I have these guys introduced first, and then we'll do questions? Make a note. We'll go to you first. Thanks. I just wanted to say something about this standard. So what a brave move this organization has taken to try to come up with some definition for producer organizations. That, that's tough, huh? But what a sea change in how that kind of work might allow ease for those kind of commercial relationships when we all, not only for the buy-sell, which is what we're talking about here today, but also for development practitioners, because oftentimes we'll have a project in one location. We're working with a group of maybe 40 cooperatives. The project ends, and then 5 years later, there's a new project with a new organization with some different approaches. And sometimes instead of finding those groups where they were, we start from the beginning again. And so hopefully this kind of a process creates ownership within those groups so they can then be building on their continued journey of professionalizing over time. And so as we talk about kind of the role of the IFC, our next speaker here, Hans, I have you next, if that's okay. So our next speaker here is Hans Thayer, who is a board member of NCBA CLUSA, and he's also the executive director of Fair Trade America. And so I'd like to welcome Hans to the podium here to introduce his organization. Thank you, Hans.
Good morning. I'm Hans Thayer. Sorry, it's a privilege for me to be here. NCBA has welcomed me for quite some time, and to me it's like extended family now, and I really appreciate the opportunity. I'm Hans. I come from Chile. I have a very patient wife for about 24 years and 2 young men, of whom I'm very proud. They're 18 and 19. And we moved to the US about 12 years ago. So my accent is funny, it's not you that have issues with listening. So I work in Fair Trade America, and I was asked to speak very briefly, because I tend to get carried away on what fair trade is. So to start with, co-ops, as you will see, are absolutely at the heart of who we are and what we do. We are a development model that supports rural communities, especially, again, organized into co-ops. That's the what. The how, to me, is really important. And those are my bosses. That's a co-op in Madagascar that grows vanilla. And 50% of fair trade is directed and guided by co-ops. One of my dear board members is a member of a coffee co-op in Guatemala, former one from Nicaragua. And again, at the international level, we're present in many countries. As you will see, 50% of the decision-making is done by co-op representatives. And co-ops are organized in 3 large co-ops of co-ops, one for Africa, one for Asia Pacific, and one for Central and South America. So to me, it is extremely unique that we work with co-ops side by side. And I work for co-ops, as you will see. I'm the sales guy for the co-ops. About my partners, who are my partners? My partners are brands that make that connection with co-ops and buy and sell under fair trade terms, and I'll go to that in a minute. So we have about 100 brands working in the US, and those do connect with co-ops. And the other very important stakeholder to me and my partners is people like you, us, people who are consumers, people who advocate for small farmers. That's the other very important stakeholder for me. In a nutshell, how does this work? As you will see on the left-hand side is the farmers, the producers, organized again in co-ops and then co-ops of co-ops. And on the other side, organizations present in about 23, 24 countries like us, Fair Trade America. And we're simply the matchmakers between the producers and the companies. We go to companies, we tell them, hey, you're big, you're mid-sized, you have your supply chains, have you considered working with small farmers? Have you considered small farmers to be your business partners? And how can that happen? We facilitate that process. And back to your point, Dieter, of professionalized co-ops, that's really crucial and very important. And Mike will be able to tell you why it is so important for companies. On the other hand, it is extremely important for co-ops as well to be business partners. We speak so much about supply chains, and we forget the human component of supply chains. And I am a broken record of saying that co-ops are not just a hub for economic purposes. A co-op is an organization of people who come together for a reason. And that reason is to sell in better terms, and that's only a means to an end. So the co-op for me is a very important thing, but a means to an end. If you speak to those people in those co-ops, it's about their families. It's about creating more opportunity for their kids. It's about the well-being of the family. And if you walk around those more mature co-ops, you will see it's about the love for our members and our families. Of course, economies of scale, et cetera, are important, but it's about that well-being of the whole community. So that's what we do. And what's very important as a tool, which is not right there, is the concept of a minimum price and a premium. So we go out to stakeholders for about a year and we do a consultation of what the minimum price for commodities should be. Bananas, coffee, et cetera, right? So we try to understand with different stakeholders, including farmers, including companies, including organizations that work around development, NCBA and others, what that minimum price should be, and we try to make that minimum price a proxy for production costs. So what is happening now, as you know, with coffee, market price is around $1 a pound. The production cost of a pound of coffee is around 1.45 cents. $1.45. I had the privilege to be in El Salvador not long ago. 800 farmers, men and women were there in an NCBA conference around coffee. 800. Ask me about the attendance rate. Here in DC, we send out 100 invitations. How many people do we show up? Not many. Look at this. Thank you for coming again. In El Salvador, it was 102%. And you might ask why 2%? It's because many farmers, men and women, are too shy. So they didn't go and make the line and register, right? 100% of them. So all this to say that those 800 men and women were extremely concerned. Someone even wondering why pick coffee cherries. It's a loss. I'll sell it for $1 and it cost me $1.45. So for us, the minimum price is one important tool. And the other is the premium. It's a small amount of money that's paid by the company on top of the minimum price, and that's used by the co-ops for social purposes. You were speaking about the importance of capitalizing a co-op. Those monies are pooled into a specific bank account with full transparency, and the co-op makes a decision of what to do with that. And it's usually something to do with social good of their communities. But there's full transparency, and for us, that's another tool of making them work together and become stronger. JT, if I run too long, you just do this, okay? I love numbers. So here are some numbers. We've been around since the 80s. We're very strong in reputation and knowledge and consumers and companies, especially in Europe. We started back in the US 7 years ago. Our products bought and sold under fair trade standards are present in about 140 countries. Back to the idea of the concept of the premium, we've generated about $153 million in over time for farmers. We are in some other parts, especially in Europe, civil society is very active through what we call fair trade towns. Again, I'm very proud of that, though they're hardcore bosses, I must say. 50% of the decision making is done by our farmers, and we work with about 1.65 million farmers in 75 countries. Having said so, I really like numbers. Numbers sing to me, but I learned a big lesson once from a lady called Fatima. She works in a coffee and now chocolate co-op in Honduras. And she said, hey, you people, i.e. me, you are fascinated with M&E. You're fascinating with measuring, and I'm so glad you're not just measuring outputs, but also outcomes. But tell me, how do you measure that I'm a mother, and I'm so proud that my kids are going to school? How do you measure that we parents are inviting them and pushing them to go to school? How do you measure the fact that we women are now together and we're working on doing microfinance? How do you measure those things? So all of us who love numbers, we should keep Fatima's words present. And I'm part of a wonderful, crazy group of people. We're about 13, and we're here in DC. And again, thank you so much.
Thanks. Thank you, Hans. Thanks. Well, that was great. I'm actually going to hand you this, Dieter, because thanks. Yeah, so mitigating risk and thinking about what are the advantages of how does fair trade come into those kinds of decision making. As I like to introduce our next speaker up here, Michael Okorafor is a friend of NCBA CLUSA. We've been working together on some projects. And it's fascinating, you know, if you open your cupboard at home, I'm sure that all of us have some McCormick's products in there, right? It's a company that is something, you know, when you go to the store and you buy these things, we're not always thinking about this business model behind that, the supply chain, how it affects smallholder farmers, how they're connecting with people in communities. What is that mathematical business thinking that allows them to take the risk to engage with smallholders? And it's exciting to have Michael on the panel here. I'd like to invite him up here and welcome him to introduce himself. Thank you, Michael.
Thank you very much. So, very good morning, everybody. I'm really delighted to be with you all. And first of all, I want to thank Doug and Rebecca and the NCBA CLUSA partners for giving me the opportunity to be with you at this time. So, she says, I'm Michael Okorafor. I'm Vice President for our Global Sustainability and Packaging Innovation. Those two functions I'm responsible for globally. But I like what Hans said. For me, the passionate one is this idea of sustainable infrastructure. And that is really very important to me. And you will see why, because I grew up in a farm community in the eastern part of Nigeria. So when I'm talking, I'm not talking just as a worker, I'm talking about somebody who lived it. And so this is really what drives me. So let me talk a little bit about McCormick. About 2 years ago, when we had our new chairman come in, we created what we call the 5 principles. Most of you knew about the 3 principles previously. Is passion for flavor, power of people, taste you can trust. But we really thought through ourselves, and I was part of the team that said, we got to think differently. What got us here may not get us where we want to go, because we have a very ambitious goal. And so 2 things, driven to innovate, came out of that. And for us, the overarching principle of purpose. Why are we here? So we came up with this purpose-led performance. So I'll talk a little bit about it. But make no mistake about it, McCormick is all about growth. If you can't grow, you can't benefit people. Okay? A dying business cannot support the type of ambitious, audacious things we want to do. So, so we're really a different kind of CPG company. When you look at some companies, they tell you they're all about, cost-cutting and all those things. That's all well and good to be profitable, but if you can't grow, you really can't make an impact. So McCormick is really a different kind of company. And one of the things we're doing is about delivering. We say what we're going to do, and we deliver on what we say we're going to do or exceed it. That's really another thing. And so part of that is building what I call an enduring McCormick of the future. I was just in Davos last month for the World Economic Forum. Obviously, some of you who were there. The theme was Globalization 4.0. So we've gone into this era of fourth industrial revolution. And people ask me, when did we end the third industrial revolution? Well, it just ended, and it wasn't equitable. So one of the goals in Davos at the World Economic Forum was this idea of trying to make the world much more equitable. Yes, we had growth in the third industrial revolution, but the top grew very much. The bottom and middle class fell down. That's not sustainable. So how do we make it? That's why I like the comment that Rebecca made. How do we make sure that this growth is equitable? And believe it or not, agriculture could be the transformational thing if we really focus on it. And you're going to see some of the things that McCormick is doing in that regard to really tell you how businesses can deliver, and it's all about purpose-driven performance. So if you look at us, McCormick really, for most of you that don't have us in your cupboards, and I doubt it, it's really about flavor. You don't want to eat boring food. It's about flavor, and it's about healthy flavor. You talk even about Madagascar. You want to talk about a good example for regenerative agriculture. There was a work stream in Davos that talked about that. That's really what we're practicing in Madagascar with our farmers. So it's very important that when we do these things, that we really make sure we really align to our purpose. We're all about flavor. Our business is split into two. The consumer, the thing you buy from every store, and it's around the globe. And also we have a major business that's a B2B. So like the Pepsis of the world, the General Mills, they buy from us. That's about 39%, and the consumer piece is about 61%. Over 16,000 products. And our sales last year was $5.4 billion. One of the things that you notice is, if you look around our portfolio, it's really so many brands. So if you are in France, Ducros is our brand, and Vahiné is our brand. If you're in the UK, Schwartz is our brand. That's McCormick. Obviously, everybody thinks it's only McCormick. And if you're in Australia, where I'm going to be next month, the brand Aeroplane, like plane, Aeroplane is our brand. Okay? And of course, our acquisition for Frenchies and Frank's. The Frank's Red Hot is probably #1 leading Red Hot, whatever you call it, flavor enhancing thing in this country today. Why is that? That's because you can put a lot of it. You can really enjoy it with a number of things. That's our brand. So what have I just said? I said McCormick is also a brand building company, because that's how you get people to really feel enamored about what you're doing. We are also a leader in clean flavor. And that is because if you look at herbs and spices, it doesn't get any cleaner. You want to look at, vanilla. It doesn't get any cleaner. Most people here don't realize, especially for those of you in NCBA, CLUSA, you know that. Vanilla is like an orchid. It grows on anything. You don't really need to do too much to get it growing, except if you don't take care of it, then you get very poor yield. So I think when you talk about regenerative agriculture, some of the things we're doing that is leading to this clean flavor is something. Same thing if you go to Vietnam, black pepper. These are the type of things that we're doing, and NCBA CLUSA is a part of it. Obviously, we have 3 major regions. North America is still our largest market, followed by Europe, Middle East, and Africa. And then the third is Asia-Pacific zone, including China. So, but the fastest growing business for us, believe it or not, is China. faster than any other thing. It's on a steroid. So we're leveraging that, so really good. So one of the things that I talk about is really when you look at our operations, we also have major joint ventures like in Mexico, in Turkey, in India. Most of you know about our AVT partnership, and NCBA CLUSA people have been part of that. And these are people that really help us drive things. But the thing I want to say is, when you look at our business, this is really why I like working with NCBA CLUSA, and of course IFC is also our partner, is because these are smallholder farmers. Everybody thinks McCormick owns these big farms. No, we don't. It's individual farmers that we work with, mom and pop farmers around the globe. And so it behooves us to make sure that we're building an enduring supply chain based on those farmers by supporting them. And so one of the things that this principle of purpose-led performance is doing for us is we looked at ourselves and said, what is really important here? Nobody really cares about what we do. Some of you have heard me say that. You know what people care about? The impact of what we do. So if you look at our sustainability, I will put them in 4 quadrants: communities, customer, consumer, and then the company. The most important thing is the communities. And when I talk about communities, yes, it's part of the jobs we're creating in Maryland, but the most important community is the farm community. So for us, those mom and pop farmers are part of us. And so that's why building resilience in those communities becomes important. At the end of the day, if they are not able to get what I call a living wage, everybody talks about minimum wage. Who cares about minimum wage when you can't afford housing or send your kid to school? That's a waste of time. And we're talking about things that don't really matter. Minimum wage, what does that mean? I'm talking about a living wage. I grew up where a living wage can send you to a very good school, can send you to somewhere. And so that, to me, is what we should be talking about. So I'm tired of hearing this minimum wage thing. If a farmer can't get a living wage, forget it. And that's why the cooperatives are very, very important. If you look at, the people at NCBA, CLUSA, IFC, they work with us, they know what I'm going to be talking about here. And that if you look at a farm community, anywhere, you know what happens? These farmers are laboring day in, day out. And they sell to middlemen, which is a very polite way of saying it. I call them henchmen. They sell to, this henchman buys it, pays them nothing, sells to another bigger henchman, a middleman. They call them collectors in Madagascar, right? They just have different names, but these are henchmen to be precise. And then these people sell to our export partner. At the end of the day, these middlemen or henchmen take all the money and leave the farmers impoverished. If you go to Madagascar, that's why when we started with NCBA CLUSA, you guys realized we had to say, we got to put some money for them so that in the lean season, and remember their crop is harvested once a year, in the lean season, they will have loans that we pay interest so they can use it to feed their kids and send them to school because they don't have living wages. Here comes co-op, which NCBA helped us create. We have several running now. Our ambition is to really touch about 25,000 farmers. Now we're at 9,000. And those cooperatives are really, they're working for themselves. They eliminated the middleman, and then they sell directly to us, to our export partner. In the process, they're making more money. And here is another benefit. You know, I grew up in a community where your word is your bond. When I was growing up, this legal thing of signing contract, forget it. If I tell you I'm going to sell all my crops to you, that's to you. And that's because there was what I call a social license to operate, which is missing today. We're trying to build all of those. These farmers are committed. Remember, we don't own them. But because we're enabling them, we're bringing training, education to them through NCBA CLUSA and our partnership with IFC. These farmers are really committed to doing the right thing. They want to do the right thing. They are the most honest, hardworking people I've ever met. And so they're selling all of this to us. They're making more money. And in the process, they're able to even build their own houses. If you go to Madagascar, most of the houses are what? On step? Remember that? You know, but now they're building what I call concrete houses, the way it should be. You know why? Because they can aggregate. Our export partner helps deliver materials that will allow them to build houses at half the cost. We've had several of them built in Madagascar. It will cost about $25,000 to build a good 4-bedroom concrete house. So now they can build it at half the cost. Why? Because when those trucks go from the big cities in the Sava region to the remote areas, they go empty. Now they transport building materials by a contractor, established contractor in the big city that can now go ahead and build those houses an aggregated cost and at half the price. To me, that's how you get, social license. That's what I mean by impact. I was down there a year and a half ago. These guys were so happy. If you know, in the African culture, when people are happy, they bring in some unique things. They got us some rapper and all those things. I was dancing. And they weren't doing it because I was one of them. They were doing it because they were wondering, McCormick, this country, far away, I don't even know where they are. They are here helping them. To me, that's impact. Okay? So one of the things that you look at, our purpose-led performance, people ask me, what does that mean? What we're saying is that we're going to be delivering industry-leading financial performance while doing the right things for our communities, especially the farm communities, our people, and our planet. We have only one planet. That's what we're saying. And the idea of thinking that business cannot thrive in a sustainable environment that is impacting the communities and the planet is wrong. We believe they can coexist and thrive. And by the way, don't take my word for it. Take the results for it. In Davos, this January, Corporate Nights, that does the global 100 most sustainable corporations in the world, they recognized we made the list. Not only did we make the list, we improved from 23 last year to 13 this year. Number 13 in the world. But that's just part of it. The kicker is, for the third year in a row, they ranked us as the #1 most sustainable corporation in food sector in the world. Last year, Nestle was a distant #2 when it comes to food. The point I'm making is this. If you're doing the right thing, your business can thrive. And for those of you who look at the stock market, you look at financial performance, our stock price this time last year was 105. Today it's 133 or 134. It's not a bad thing. So what am I saying? You can do this idea of purpose-led performance is really simply put, doing well by doing good. So they can coexist. I'm going to stop there because I'm sure there are very many questions. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Michael. Thank you, Michael. I love hearing about purpose-led performance. I think it's a great way to think about a lot of things in addition to running a multinational firm, actually. Our final speaker is my colleague, and as Michael's mantra is purpose-led performance, Will thinks a lot about aligning incentives when he's thinking about kind of the business models and the space that he's in. And so there's a lot of different factors in his approach to kind of thinking about how we as an organization connect with the smallholder farmer and to the various actors in the value chain, including the off-takers. And so with that, I'd like to introduce my colleague Will as our final speaker. Be taking notes. We'll start with questions right away. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you again, everyone, for coming out. It's quite an illustrative group we've got here, and I will try to be brief. Rebecca said that she kind of views the cooperative development practice that we have as being a subsector of the economic development practice that we have. But really, I think our strengthening co-op practice is the keeper of the fire for the organization. And these cooperative principles that practice area has is what we use across all of our practice areas. And I'd like to provide just a brief overview and some examples of what we're doing in economic development. Our approach is to work cooperatively, and we support the cooperative business model, and we also work with important partners. That includes our donors, USAID, USDA, but also the business sector. The business sector is an important partner that we work with in creating business systems that meet the needs of both the market and providing that high quality, safe product for buyers, and creating a system that's equitable for farmers so that they have an incentive to continue to produce and be part of that system. we bring together industry, and we bring together the government and rural communities in creating business models that can serve everybody involved. We create joint solutions to shared challenges. Examples of this work is our work in the Dominican Republic with USDA, where we're working with opening up new markets through the creation of food safety systems that meet the requirements of those markets. Another example is what we're doing in Central America. This is really addressing climate change that has moved debilitating disease into growing areas for coffee and was really affecting supply. It takes a coordinated approach because these changes to the system affect points throughout the system. And our approach is to go in and work with everyone to find those solutions. And in many countries around the world, there's a growing youth demographic. The largest demographic is youth. Finding jobs in rural communities is a challenge. And we work with cooperatives and with those communities in creating business systems that are inclusive and provide opportunities for youth to join those systems. An example of the kind of work we do is reflected in what we've done in Southeast Asia. And what we've done in Southeast Asia is something that we've done in partnership with a constellation of groups and that we've done over time. All of the organizations represented up here on the stage have participated in that. And I think the results speak for themselves on creating a system that's the largest supplier of specialty coffee and spices in Asia. The example here of Madagascar that's been mentioned earlier, I think, is an example of, this is an established system. Madagascar is the #1 producer of vanilla by far. They produce 80% of the world's vanilla, and this has been going on for decades. But it's a system that hasn't been equitable for those farmers. And so we're working with our partners, with McCormick, which is really critical in that, with the government, and creating changes to the policy environment and encouraging cooperatives to address these kind of old established systems that aren't sustainable in the long run and aren't providing that needed benefit to the people that are critical to its survival long term. And on the other end of the spectrum, we have the work that we're doing with USDA in Senegal in millet, where here you have a value chain that has not really been part of the commercial economy. It's something that people grow for subsistence, but there's a recognition of that economic opportunity, and that requires the creation of an entire new system, a new way of thinking and new business relationships in order to move that product from something that's just consumed in the village to something that can meet urban demand, but also create wealth and job opportunities there in rural communities where it's needed most. And I'd like to leave you with this image of operations in Southeast Asia. This shows the constellation of cooperatives throughout the region that's involved in producing a variety of spices, specialty coffee. This is a vast geographical area and involves hundreds of thousands of farmers. And this has been created not by NCBA CLUSA, but through this cooperation between all of our partners, and shows the potential of what can be built when we work together over years. Thank you.
Thank you. So thanks, everyone. What a wonderful start to getting people thinking about sustainable supply chains and cooperatives. I have a lot of questions for the panel, but I think I've been seeing people take copious notes, and I had promised a first question. So let's go ahead and open it up for questions and see where that brings us. Please go ahead, sir. Thank you. Oh, we have a microphone, I think, too, here, right behind you.
Here you go.
Thanks. My name is Lauren Epstein, and the question's for Dieter. It's two questions. One, I love that you're creating an ISO standard for the work that you're doing. That's fantastic. I was wondering if in the standard, if there's any metrics for local economy, like a measurement of how the local economy is impacted. And the other question was, are there towns, counties, places in the U.S. that qualify for these types of projects because of the situation there?
Thanks. First, I'd like to just say on the ISO standard, IFC is an active participant, but we have a number of other colleagues in the room who are also working on this project over the last couple of years. So the guidelines don't cover local communities, although there was a very interesting debate at the last meeting where we developed a consensus about what's the proper role of cooperatives in their communities. So there is language about providing benefits to the wider community. Although most of the people in the room felt that focused on the business was the most important aspect of it, because if the business didn't succeed, then none of the other parts could work either. So I think that's one of the interesting tensions amongst the very wide sort of global stakeholders that joined this meeting is what is the right role for producer organizations? And then to your second question, we only work in emerging markets, although we do work with US companies and other companies from Europe and Asia. So we work with those companies as long as they have supply chains in emerging markets.
Thank you. A little microphone passing.
Hi, Jim Schulman with the Alliance for Regional Cooperation. My question is based on my own confusion because the word sustainability has multiple meanings, and a number of them have been used today. So please forgive the provinciality of my question, but certainly climate change, climate catastrophe has been mentioned. I had thought this event might deal with the environmental side of sustainability and towards that end reducing and shortening supply chains. And so maybe I'm just at the wrong event. But I'm wondering if any of you want to speak to that issue, and maybe it ties to Lauren's question that he just asked, in that is it their work that any of you are doing to try to build markets within the regions where these foods are produced so that it doesn't have to travel all the way to the United States, that a living wage could be garnered by exporting maybe to the next country over and not necessarily all the way across the ocean?
So you want me to take that?
Sure.
I think you're asking a business question, and that's a very pertinent question that I should address, at least tell you how we're thinking about it. Is that okay? All right, so first of all, what you said is absolutely correct. For a global brand like us, we sell everywhere. So if you go to Madagascar, you buy sustainably sourced crops. You go to Vietnam, black pepper is a big thing for us there. You buy sustainably sourced ones. You go to Indonesia. One of the things that people don't realize, these farmers like in Indonesia that farm cinnamon, and most people don't know that cinnamon is a bark of a tree. It takes about 20 years to grow to maturity. If you harvest it prematurely, guess what? It dies. But if you harvest it when it's mature, it regenerates itself. So we have products there. But think about it this way. If they sold only to Vietnam, the livelihood, you have zero chance of improving their livelihood. So they have to sell both amongst their people, right? So they can eat healthy food as well as export to generate money. Most of these countries are not Saudi Arabia that export oil. This cash crop is their oil. This cash crop is how they generate revenue. So it is important for us to appreciate that. That's one thing. Secondly, Some of these areas, you just heard that a place like Madagascar produces over 80% of world vanilla. You wouldn't be having your vanilla ice cream. I'm talking about natural vanilla. Forget the synthetic ones. We don't deal with that. Natural vanilla, the healthy thing that keeps your body sustainable, right? You wouldn't be having it if there is no Madagascar. I've heard people say, why can't we grow it here, right? I live in Maryland, right? That's where our global headquarters is. Until you move the equator, you need the tropics to grow it. You can grow it inside the building. It's not going to be enough to meet the markets. And by the way, you're talking about preserving the climate. By giving them technology, working with IFC, working with NCBA, CLUSA, we send even our own agronomists to those communities to teach them how to farm. When I was growing up, and I'm speaking for somebody that grew up in a farm community, a rural community, my mom was a subsistence farmer. Most of you heard me say that before. They used to burn the land. When you burn it, guess what you're doing? Destroying it. That's because they didn't have the knowledge of what it takes to grow regeneratively. We're bringing that knowledge. The problem we have is we believe that life begins and ends in one community. No. Sustainability is about building a healthy ecosystem. Okay? And that healthy ecosystem means that if we hear about cyclone, and I don't know, sir, if you know what a cyclone is, it's not tornado. Cyclone is like tornado on steroids, including, you know what I mean? So people have no clue what that is. So if we don't teach them how to practice regenerative agriculture, help them with their landscape, because of the knowledge that we have, knowledge base of how to preserve landscape, we're wasting our time because there'll be no Madagascar in a few years, there'll be no Vietnam, there'll be no India. So that's why it's important that, one, we enable them to produce much more than they can use so they can export it. Two, that we're there when there are things. I think it was in 2017, you had the cyclone Nawo. Anybody remember that? In Madagascar, wiped out this, so many things in the Sava region that produces the vanilla, the world vanilla. Within the first week, we were there. We weren't there with McCormick engineers and saying, no. We were there through our NGO partner that lives in that community. In fact, at that time, one of the NCBA CLUSA guys was still living in Antananarivo, and we had him working with CARE. And I don't know if you know, NCBA CLUSA created CARE. Michelle Non is our partner, a big champion of what we're doing. They had people living in those communities. We sent money. Money can't do anything without people with expertise. And within the first month, they were rebuilding before even Red Cross and other people came on there. So what am I saying? If you don't view this as a global ecosystem where we have to really enable other communities to grow, so the globalization 4.0 would then be a waste. We go back to the third industrial revolution that never paid off for everybody. That's what the mission is about here. I hope that paints a picture for you when we talk about sustainability in a true sense, we're talking about it in a global sense. Does that help?
Thank you.
You're welcome.
If I could add to that, a component of sustainability is this idea of equity across the supply chain and farmers having greater income. They have to have that economic incentive when a cyclone hits, or when, as in Central America, you have coffee leaf rust that had wiped out trees, to reinvest. And if they don't have that economic incentive, then it's not sustainable. And in a lot of places around the world right now, in emerging markets, the margins are so thin that sustainability, if they're hit with shocks, is in question. And especially in an era of climate change where the shocks are coming more frequently and it's difficult to predict, sustainability is a very important question.
Dieter, go ahead.
So when IFC looks at sustainability, we look at the triple bottom line, so financial, social, and environmental sustainability. And the social and environmental sustainability are captured in our performance standards. So there's 8 of these standards, and the one particularly related to environment is called the standard on biodiversity. You may also be familiar with the equator principles that many of the multinational banks follow. So those were derived from our performance standards. and other development finance organizations around the world also use this similar framework. So if you're curious, those performance standards are online, but also what's online is what we call the Environmental and Social Action Plan. So every investment has an ESAP, Environmental Social Action Plan, which looks at where the company stands in respect to the performance standards, and then it gives a period of time to reach each performance standard. And then so you can track that through the disclosure website. And another thing to mention about climate is that we have a target to have about a third of our investments tagged as climate smart. And so for each type of investment, we have various methodologies for looking at the climate smartness of the investment. I can just give you one example. In the dairy sector, we're using a new tool that was developed by FAO called the GLEAM-I, which is a way of looking at GHG emissions in animal protein systems. And so what we're doing is looking for interventions that improve productivity per unit of GHG emitted. And so we're both looking at productivity levels, like milk production per cow, but also at the levels of GHG from the baseline to the new practices. Because, of course, not all ways of improving productivity also are GHG negative. So in each different sector, we're looking at particular metrics that we can use to tag these investments as being climate smart.
Rebecca?
Please, go ahead.
A couple of things. One is sometimes we fall into looking at the world through the lens of the US. We're a market of 330 million people. Just to give you some stats, El Salvador, I think population is about 6 million people. Chile has grown to 14. So Brazil and Mexico, at least in the region, I'm most, Brazil, Mexico, and Argentina, in my region at least, are the biggest markets. But in general terms, they're very, very small markets. So that's the first thing. The second thing to say is co-ops are small businesses. They're smart people, believe me. They're really good at what they do. So their choices, whether to export or whether to sell locally, is something that they make the decision upon that. It's not something we impose. We facilitate, yes, but again, the decision is made by them. Third, I think Michael was speaking about, Michael or Dieter were talking about some issues that small farmers in very remote areas have to face in their local realities. In coffee, there's a coyote. In vanilla, there's the equivalent of a coyote, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. In Asia, it's the same. So many a time, if they don't agglomerate or come together in a co-op and then make their business decisions, they are at the mercy of people who will really try to cheat them. And I'm not saying humanity is bad, et cetera, but they've been used and abused for a long time by those coyotes and equivalent. So that was just another angle too. And I won't get into sustainability because that could take us for the next 2 hours.
Thanks, guys. Other questions? Greg?
Hi, Greg Rothy from Land O'Lakes. Thanks a lot for your presentation. One of the things I think about when I think about cooperatives and supply chains is trust. And how can we create increased levels of trust across the supply chain so we can deliver some of those objectives of higher quality, safe foods. And I think of, how do you build trust in a system at the consumer level? You want safe, high quality food. How do you think about building trust as one of those elements to create more sustainable supply chains in your different activities and businesses?
I can start with that actually, Greg. Technology has changed a lot of things for smallholder farmers in the last 10 years, and I know that everyone on this panel has some experience with this too. When smallholder farmers, when co-op members are living in rural areas and they just have one cow, they don't have 5 cows, they don't have very much land, they're not really a leader in the community. When they're in that co-op, they're an equal to everyone else, for crying out loud. And with the technology that's available these days, information flows so differently. And I think that one way that trust has certainly been, one way that levels of trust can be improved within those kinds of transactions, just the availability of information. We talk about this in the supply chain sense as well. People can live in a community. They may not have running water, they may not have electricity, but certainly in Africa, where a lot of us work, they can access information. So a buyer, an off-taker like McCormick's that has a relationship with their local buying partner, this information can flow right to my phone as a small farmer instantaneously. This is transformative in some ways. I'll let my other colleagues kind of comment, but I feel like that's one place where it's really been a game changer in terms of people's willingness to sell. This is my whole life right here. This is how I'm going to feed my kids and do all that. Where do I put that money? Do I put it in a co-op? A coyote looks good because I get cash right there, you know, but some of these systems are changing that a little bit. I'll let the guys go.
Let me build on that. Trust is the #1 currency going forward in our business, okay? And so everything we do is about building trust. By the way, trust is not something you can legislate. It's something you earn. Is that fair? So let me give you an example of how we're doing that. One example is we're committed that, I don't think most of you have read our purpose-led performance report. I encourage you to maybe share that. You have a copy and make sure some people get it. We've made a commitment that by 2025, most of our smallholder farmers will be equipped with handheld technology devices. Remember, some of those villages, they don't have power constantly, right? But we're giving them tablets. We're working with a company, a German company called Farm Force, and I don't know if you've heard about them. They're working with us, enabling our individual farmers to have access to tablet technology. It allows them to track their input, and it allowed them to know when it will rain. If in case of vanilla, you know, you have to go at a particular time to pollinate it by hand because you don't have enough bees to pollinate the vanilla when the thing blooms, right? So they're tracking all these things. But guess what? We're paying for it. We're paying for it because it's the right thing. It's one way you can build trust. And when they enter all those things, it's a simple thing. You don't need to go to school to enter all those things. When they come back to their locality, to their town or village, this thing is up. They have access to Wi-Fi. It uploads through the cloud. Farm Force manages that. Guess what? We get access to it. So we know where there is the next need. But here's what it's doing. I was in the Denizli region of Turkey. This is where they grow oregano. And the farmers, you know, the testimony they were giving me, we've done this for over 1,000 farmers there. And one of them came, I went to the villages in the mountains, in the Denizli area, and he had a car. He said, you know, his son that is in the university now wants to come back to the village and practice, you know, take over his father's business because he's saying, now I can use technology. And you know, these millennials, they are more technology savvy than old men like me. I have 4 of them, so I know what I'm talking about. They don't think I know anything, by the way. But when it comes to technology, they are very savvy. So that's an incentive for him to come back and become a farmer. Instead of going to the big city to just look for a job and sometimes you can't pay your rent. So that's the point I'm making. So that's how you build trust. I can tell you, going forward, if you want to build a sustainable infrastructure, you have to embed it with what I call incentives that cultivate trust. And the second thing is, I found out because we were there, in fact, they had them come to like a hotel for like a conference where we were there. We handed prizes to those that have sustainable resource materials. One of the things that this is doing, for us is creating loyalty. You remember when I talked about social license? That was critical when I was growing up. We're building that. When you combine that with trust, you're golden. You don't need to sign a contract for them to be loyal to you because they see the benefit, they see their kids want to take over things. That, to me, is a critical thing. So you asked a very important question. Thank you.
Dieter? Yeah.
Brilliant question. That's one of the things I face when speaking with large corporations. McCormick is a very positive exception, is please trust the co-op trust their quality, trust their supply, et cetera, et cetera. So to me, a fundamental piece in building that trust is that both parties, the company and the co-op, see each other as business partners. This idea of supply chain, again, dehumanizes the side of the families, the co-ops, the small businesses. So let me give you an example. So back in the day, I was told directly by a leader in a coffee co-op. Back in the day, the big companies would fly in, right? Ride the pickup truck for hours in the bumpy road, get there, the members of the co-op would come in with their samples of coffee. These people would meet in a room, farmers outside looking, right outside looking through the windows, but not being in the room. So these coffee curators would grade them, et cetera, Then they would come out and say, I'll buy from you X number of bags at this price. I'll buy from you this number of bags at this other price. And then they would leave. Fast forward 10 years later, they fly in. Roads are a little better, but they're still bumpy. And they meet together in that room because those coffee curators, which is a certification, by the way, farmers have their own coffee curators as well. So they sit together, they taste, they discuss, they analyze why the flavor, why the taste, et cetera, and they're business partners. And it's not anymore this one way, I'll buy from you, and this sort of unilateral relationship. It's a business relationship. That, to me, is a huge, huge pillar of building that trust. And that's why strengthening co-ops, and that's why co-ops, to me, is so fundamental.
So I would totally agree with these two colleagues, because I think trust or loyalty, depending on how you call it, is absolutely critical. And especially when you start getting into longer-term finance. And it's important both at the individual farmer level and at the aggregation or the co-op level. Because if the farmers aren't selling their product to the co-op, and then the co-op is not selling their product on to the final off-taker, the system breaks down. And one of the most difficult issues, I think, in smallholder supply chains is how do you incentivize this long-term finance and make it possible so that banks will be willing to come in, so that off-takers will be willing to come in. And so, I mean, one of the approaches that we've been working with is the idea of segmentation. So I think what we believe is that, you know, not all smallholder farmers are likely to be loyal, and necessarily not all co-ops may be loyal. And there could be, if you use quantitative assessment methodologies, you can begin to understand what characteristics are more likely to create a loyal, trustful relationship, and which are less. And I can tell you about one example that we've done some research for a client in West Africa in the cocoa value chain. And they wanted to know, you know, amongst these, 5,000 farmers, which ones are likely to be more loyal, because we'd like to offer longer-term finance to those farmers. So we've been using a tool which is it's sort of like Simple Poverty Scorecard. It's called SWIFT, and it's a way of estimating household income through about 10 asset-based questions. So it's a fairly simple methodology. And so we looked at this SWIFT data, and then we also looked at track record of selling to the company, and we looked at other characteristics of the farm. And it was quite interesting because the sort of top 20% were actually among the least loyal. And it was because they had more capacity to search out other markets. They may even have had vehicles. And so those were not the most loyal. And then at the bottom of the supply chain, you had farmers that were loyal but produced very little product. And their farms tended to be smaller, older trees. And so there was kind of a sweet spot in the middle where farmers both had capacity to increase productivity, but also showed a track record of repaying the company. And so we're looking for those set of characteristics. And I think that's the starting point, because if you can demonstrate there's a trust relationship with a particular segment of the farmers or the co-ops, then you can show an example, and then you can bring others on board. And I think the example that we've been hearing about in Indonesia and Timor is exactly how that works, and it takes a long time. It's years and years of working together, building trust, showing that there's a mutual benefit, and bringing people out of a short-term thinking. That's the key, you know, both on the company side and the farmer side, because if people think short term, oh, price is down, we have to pay less, or on the farmer side, oh, this guy's offering me 10 cents more, then it all breaks down. So you need to have that long-term relationship.
And I think part of that is this closer relationship between the buyer and the seller. We've mentioned middlemen, and one of the challenges that that model presents is there's a disconnect in information on what the market demands is blocked and doesn't get down to the farmer. And being able to communicate that directly to the farmer builds trust.
And really, we do some very tactical things as well in terms of thinking about how do you develop these long-term relationships. And some of our co-ops that are in the, you know, they're in their early stages of having some of these first sales, you know, our training includes, we'll call the buyer after 6 months, see how it went, see how they like the quality, kind of start to establish those practices within the organization that have a long view. It's not just a transactional relationship anymore. Yeah, thanks. Question? Oh, please, go ahead.
I think your discussion is really tying into the question that I was going to ask, so we might circle back. My name is Neeru Pradhan. I'm with USDA's Foreign Agricultural Service. And my question is, how can working with cooperatives address, in part, the excessive speculation and price volatility that we see in the global trade in spices? I think all of you are, on some level, getting at that when you talk about shortening the chain between buyers and sellers, building trust, establishing social license to operate. But I wonder if we could think about that specifically with regards to price volatility and speculation.
You want me to take it? That's all right. Okay. Being an enterprise, right? That's what McCormick is. We're a business enterprise. It is important for us to have some level of stability across our supply chain, okay? So when you look at our strategy, the strategy is not just helping the farmer with co-ops, with training and things like that. The strategy is also looking at the planet, the environment under which they operate, and ways we can show up things. We're working with WWF on some landscape issues that will mitigate. You know, climate change is real. All we can do is to proactively work towards mitigating those. So this concept of regenerative farming is something that we really like, because what that means, you are not disrupting the soil, there have been less erosion as a result of all the farming activities. So it's important for us to invest in those areas. That's not something that you tie to your profit. You know what I mean? These are things, we call it building resilience. And let me define resilience. It's not the simple English word that the way you define it. For us, resilience means building capacity and capability in farm communities. So you want to make sure that you enable them to do more than they are doing today. And that's why working with experts, in most cases, NGOs. The reason is, I view it because they go in there, you know, most of you will agree with this. People that work in the NGO space go there because they have a heart. Most people that work in business start with their head. And that's not enduring. The short term comes when you focus on your head only. But when you bring your heart and the head, you can do what we do with our purpose-led performance. You can deliver the financial performance while doing the right things for the communities and the planet. So if you have a combination of heart and head, you do things right. To me, that's how you really respond, to make sure that those communities are enduring communities. And we've seen that happen. And to me, that's why I'm very upbeat about this. It's really, I go to sleep at night feeling at peace, because at least we've made some level impact on doing the right thing. Not the best thing, the right thing, because the right thing endures. Does that help you?
I would add to that if we take the example of a few commodities right now, vanilla, black pepper, and coffee, the vanilla price has been rising and rising and is at historic highs. Pepper pricing has crashed, right? And coffee, the prices have gone down, and the commodity price for coffee is below production cost. But for those farmers that can get certification and can get tied in with a buyer, that volatility is greatly reduced. And there's coffee producers that are producing high quality coffee that are far above that production cost. And the same with the spices. It requires the knowledge and the professionalism in production to be able to get that certification and link in with the buyers too. And one of the incentives to do that is the reduction of risk in the system and protecting yourself from the volatility.
Go ahead.
I think a key issue around addressing volatility is productivity. So if farmers can increase productivity, they can weather lower prices much better. And I think what tends to happen is when prices fall, the lowest productivity farmers find they can't make a living anymore. And so then they abandon, and that exacerbates the price swings. So I feel like productivity is a key element, but it's also not enough. So I think it ties back to the issue of trust. And so when there's a trust along the supply chain, then companies would be more willing to offer a stable price throughout the year. And one of the examples we're working with is not in spices, it's in dairy. But in pasture-based system, there's a huge fluctuation in the volume of milk due to the amount of fodder that's available. And so, in the rainy season, there's lots of fodder, and the milk price drops. In the dry season, it rises. And so the dairies find themselves in a situation where there's a glut of milk at one time of the year, and then they feel like they can pay lower prices then, but then suddenly there's very little milk, and they're competing with the local cheese market, and they can't get enough milk. So the key is to be able to offer a more stable price across the year. But if you don't have that trust relationship, it can't work. So I think tying that pricing relationship to other things like community benefits, like training, like access to finance, that's then how you create that trust that allows farmers to have a more stable price.
It's interesting you said that. I'm sure you know about our current work with IFC in Madagascar. We're actually providing lower interest rate money, partnering with IFC to vanilla farmers. And the reason that is it would allow them weather all these highs and lows in their system. So that's one way but here's the catch. The farmers have to commit to what we call sustainable certification, meaning you don't damage the soil. There are certain things, we have some criteria, and you get a premium for that, okay? But it ensures that you can keep price stability. But that's what I mean. You got to really come up with your heart and your head at the same time, and you want to do the right thing. And that's why we're doing all of that. By the way, we're not a charitable organization. We're doing it because our business, the most important thing for our business, an enduring supply chain. If there is no enduring supply chain, forget all this profit, is gone. So that's why we're doing it. It's the right thing.
And to help, please go ahead, Hans.
So together with trust, long-term relationships, the minimum price, a small farmer with 1.5 hectares of coffee, which is the average size of a plot, by the way, and as most of you know, 75% of our coffee comes from small farmers. That farmer, he or she cannot get access to risk mitigating tools, correct? A co-op can. And co-ops are investing in risk mitigation tools, especially around pricing.
So an example in our project with IFC in Tanzania, which is the foundation for our USAID activity in Tanzania, we're working with maize farmers who are selling into the Farm to Market Alliance. Well, maize co-ops, boy, you have to have a lot of maize to make money in those. And when the price starts going down, there's a real risk. And so our training module says, okay, we're looking at, this goes to the professionalization and getting these cooperatives to be business oriented. So we're saying, okay, let's look at some other income flows that you might be able to get. And how can we create kind of a broader platform of income into this cooperative because you're cooperative? Let's take advantage of this collective action and offer some other lines, because in staple crops it's tricky. It's all these different commodities have their own unique issues like that. But so that's another way that we're sort of thinking about how do we address some of these volatility issues, because they're always going to be there. And we're thinking about how can these businesses become more resilient to withstand some of those changes, either market changes or weather changes or whatever they might be. Good question. Thank you.
Hi, my name's Ellen Reed, and I'm with the World Cocoa Foundation and the George Washington University. My question's more for Mr. Bullock. You mentioned a focus on engaging rural youth, and I'm wondering if you could go more into detail about what types of activities that entails and what the desired long-term impact would be.
Excellent question. Rural youth is a challenge around the world. We've got the farming demographic and those that own farms is getting older and older, and I think the average is in the high 50s as it is. And the challenge is creating an economic incentive for youth to go into these businesses. In many instances, they see how hard their parents work and say, I do not want part of that. I don't want that life. And there's new options that are coming up, and they have access to information about those options. What we've been doing is working through the cooperative model and providing some other things for them to consider. Working with the cooperatives, their parents, and mentors within the community to help them understand what they can do, how they can become members of the cooperative and understand what the economic return is going to be. At the same time, working with the cooperative so that that economic return is maximized. And then looking at other services that they can provide in the community as employees for the cooperative, as service providers on farms, doing a variety of things that are needed. Engaging with technology and engaging with mechanization and bringing new technology to production that might be more expensive than one small farmer can use, but as a business makes a lot of sense to go around and provide that service to the farmers in your community.
Maybe just a quick addition to that. I think we have to be willing to admit that perhaps not all smallholder farmers are meant to be smallholder farmers. And as we go forward, we think farm sizes will probably increase and that people will get out of farming. And so this idea of segmentation again comes in. And so if we think of that graph that I showed where you have the professionalization, you know, we hope as many farmers as possible can climb that ladder and become more professional, and similarly with co-ops. But it's possible that some farmers at the lower end of the professionalization ladder may never be able to make that climb. So what we want to do is find the farmers that have the capacity to make the jump up and then help them climb up the ladder. And that's where I think youth comes in, because if farming becomes more professional, it becomes more attractive, it becomes more like a business, that's going to attract the youth. So I do think we have to be realistic about the current population of smallholder farmers.
And that's a tough line for development practitioners, right? So we're given a region, we have some expectations of who's going to be involved, and there's some smallholders that may be well placed to participate in another kind of project, but maybe it's not this one. And sometimes it's hard to delineate that when there's a requirement of that business orientation to have that long-term sale like that. So these are tough calls in the development community. There's different kinds of development that happens, and sometimes we're not so comfortable drawing those lines in that way. Mm-hmm.
Just add one point to that. Please. I think there's a very interesting debate that we have with our colleagues at the World Bank about where is the public good in these supply chains and where's the private good. And I think when you get down more to the subsistence level, to the more nascent cooperatives, there are more challenging partners for large companies. And so we believe that's a public good, and there's a proper role for government, and there's a proper role for our colleagues at the World Bank to work at that side. And we have debates about sort of where is the line between the public and the private good.
My name is Eilish Zambilji, and I have a question also riding on the tails of youth engagement, but also I'm thinking about areas with protracted conflicts or recovering from protracted conflicts, and this idea of risk sharing or the role of and the place of, excuse me, cooperatives in these countries. You know, when you think about Nigeria, for example, there's such a large youth population, and they're really vulnerable to becoming a part of other types of opportunities that might provide for them in ways that they are not able to provide for their own families and communities. And Nigeria is not obviously the only example there, but curious what your work is or where you see the place of cooperatives and how you tackle that idea of risk sharing in areas such as those.
What do you mean by protracted conflict?
Yeah, so conflicts that are lasting much longer than they used to be and seem to be incredibly complex. We just released a report on Nigeria. I'm from CSIS, so this is where my thought is coming from. But where you have different zones of influence, some that are influenced by climate change and farmer-herder conflicts, and others that are from insurgent groups or so on. So the conflicts are not only single in scope, but have a lot of different factors going into them.
So maybe I should address it this way. Instead of speaking in parables, let me give specific examples that will illustrate what you're saying. You have the cattle ranchers that are competing for grazing land with farmers. And by the way, one of the things probably you should know is we source ginger from Nigeria. The best ginger comes from Nigeria. Just using that, we do other things, but that's one of the things. And some of those areas are vulnerable to grazing, okay? So what you're asking is, how do we come in as a business and build an enduring supply chain in such an area? So one of the things we're doing, and this is just something we're beginning to set up, is we're going to continue to source because there's available ginger. Nigeria has a lot of population, so agriculture has to be an aspect of it. Yes, people think, and to your point, petroleum, where Nigeria is what, the 5th largest supplier of crude petroleum to the United States. I'm sure you know that. So that's going to be there. But remember, we're talking about sustainable planet. So when you look at that, one of the things we're doing, we want to be engaged in the transformation. And we're partnering with University of Nigeria, which is a land-grant university, just like Michigan State or Penn State, all those things. And one of the things we're doing, we have an MOU that we're working through, is we're asking the university to set aside, people from the agricultural sciences, a professor is leading this work, to really start to cultivate something like ginger, because that's in the same area that you still have available land. They have, what I call vacant hectares that they can use, but do it under, I wouldn't call it a cooperative, under an agric extension where the university becomes the enabling technology provider. And then you get the private farmers to work in that. That's just one example. And the reason we're doing that, again, is so that we can build some level of stability and enduring supply chain while helping mitigate the conflicts. And of course, these conflicts are localized in certain regions, which happens to be where we get our, our crop. But by doing that, we're hoping that long-term, we can overcome the ups and lows of that kind of system. But more importantly is we're getting people with good skills to get into the agricultural community. That's how we're doing it.
I would add that people that are economically marginalized are easier to pull into conflict. And so the work that we do in getting more resources and a brighter future for those people helps to mitigate this danger of conflict. NCBA CLUSA has worked in a number of conflict-prone areas. We've been working in Mozambique since the end of the Civil War. I think that the work that we did there in cooperative development and in communities helped to build trust within those communities. And we're still working in Mozambique. In El Salvador, we were working there through the Civil War and in these conflicted communities. There's a number of examples of where we've been able to work in a conflict zone in economic development to help to stabilize things.
From my perspective, if I may, the better the co-ops do on their business side, the better. For example, I'm back to your point about the sort of less traditional businesses that flourish out of co-ops. In West Africa, especially in Cote d'Ivoire, we're promoting the youth to become monitors to prevent child labor, which, as you know, it's one of our humanity's worst diseases. and the youth are involved, they have a different perspective and they become monitors, and there's an income that springs out of that co-op. And back to sort of less traditional conflict, a couple of years ago, my wife was talking to a lady in a co-op, a banana producing co-op in Colombia. And she said it's fundamental for us to do well economically speaking in the co-op. In that way, our kids will have work and will not go into the drug industry. So from my perspective, the better they do economically speaking, connecting with companies, et cetera, the better.
Just make one comment on this, I think. So IFC is doing more and more work in fragile and conflict-affected states. We've recently done an investment in Afghanistan in a raisin exporter outside of Kandahar. And it's extremely challenging. And I think what we're learning is that the costs are very high, and you need to take a lot of innovative approaches to actually make things work. So I think you have to recognize that costs will be higher, and I think that brings you into the public good space more than private good. And then one other thing I think is could be a game changer is digital payments. Because one of the big risks in fragile places is bags of cash moving around. And so the more that farmers can be paid directly into bank accounts, I think that's going to help to alleviate some of the issues.
Thanks for the question. And we only have 10 minutes left, believe it or not. Alex, final question? Thanks.
So I'm Alex from NCBA CLUSA. Thank you very much for the...
Here's the microphone.
Thank you very much for the tremendous presentation and sharing the lessons learned with us. With a changing world, some would say the world is going the wrong direction. I think we're probably the optimists here. I think there's a lot of good, positive things going on in the world. The world is probably much better now than it was a couple decades ago. This is an example of extremely good work that is taking us in a very positive, that optimist, the future really. My question to you is, how can we do more of this, more intentional with scale and more impact, and bring the entire community, both donors, private sector, communities, civil society, to really do it at scale? And how can we achieve that scale? Because we are doing some good things all around, but how can we really start moving the needle?
Big question. Go ahead. Go.
So I can tell you, what we believe. Obviously, you talk about cooperative. We think there needs to be a much stronger cooperative between the government donors, people like NCBA that have expertise. You have expertise that we don't have, and then companies that are willing to commit, not just uptake, but also co-invest. So this concept of matching funds from the donors are critical. We're doing that with you guys around the globe. But the thing for me is we're doing it in pockets. And we're not building what I call sustaining activities in those regions. I'll give you one example. USDA, NCBA CLUSA, we partnered in East Timor. Maybe most of you remember that, on cloves. It was an issue where they needed to diversify their economy because they just came out of some serious things, right? And it was USDA provided some funding. In fact, NCBA was there. And we were the first set of clothes that were generated. We committed to taking it out, right? We bought all of it, right, at going rate. Can we do more of that instead of just doing one-off? And I'm not sure that after that investment in East Timor, I'm using East Timor as an example, that we've done more with this spirit of cooperative between the companies that take it, the global companies, the government that can fund some of it, be it USDA or USAID, and of course NCBA CLUSA that can bring expertise. We need to do that. And sometimes we spend time worrying about the flavor of the day, for lack of a better word, the issue we have. Can we build some type of continuity in those programs, in those countries, whether it be Madagascar, Vietnam, Indonesia, Nigeria? Let's build in those things. Côte d'Ivoire for cocoa farmers. And by the way, let's talk about diversification. I think, I heard that from Dita a few minutes ago. We're going to look at income diversification. For instance, if you're planting a tree like cinnamon that takes 20, 25 years to mature? Can you have other things in the meantime, and by the way, that can grow in that same region? And we can bring all of that together. We don't have to be, it doesn't have to be herbs and spices only. It could be other things. And that's what we need to do. But the good news is, a lot of companies that I talk to, like Mars, Frank Mars, who is a friend of mine, we're realizing that, you know, this spirit of what I call co-opetition, collaborate to compete, has to drive us in the future. We can't just view each other as competitors. I'm talking about the business world. And then it will really reinforce the work that you're doing and create confidence in the system. That's how we have to approach it to make sure we have an enduring supply chain.
I was going to go ahead for a
I was just going to follow on to what you were saying about this collaborative and competition space. I think the key is this pre-competitive space, and we see more and more that companies are willing to work together. We're involved in an initiative in Brazil in the soy sector where big companies, big traders are discussing how they could share data around traceability and sustainability and compliance with local regulations. And I also think there's a very good example that we have in this room amongst the practitioners of pre-competitive space in the EMEA group. And so we have a number of organizations that would normally compete on, you know, funding bids, and everyone is working together on key problems like this professionalization definition. And so I think that kind of collaboration can lead to breakthroughs that can really lead to scaling.
That's a great last comment, and I think that OCDC, the group that we're part of, the Cooperative Development Organizations, is also one of those spaces where, you know, let's find that common ground. That was a great last question, Alex, and I think that at least what I've heard from today is that these sustainable supply chain solutions and cooperatives requires lots of different actors, lots of different skill sets, lots of different levels of commitment, and to move forward and to kind of continue on strengthening those relationships, it takes all kinds of actors like those represented both on the panel and in the room. And with that, I'd really love to thank Will, Hans, Michael, and Dieter for your time today. The conversation was excellent. If you could all help me in giving them a round of applause.